A very warm welcome to our public forum on the politics of education policy, evidence, expertise and influence, sponsored by the Australian Association for Research in Education through a strategic initiative grant to its special interest group on education policy and politics. My name's Nicole Mockler and I'm one of the co-conveners, along with my colleagues Helen Proctor and Remy Lowe, of the School and Teacher Education Policy Research Network here at the University of Sydney. Established in 2011, our research network is comprised of approximately 20 academic staff, both within and slightly beyond the School of Education and Social Work, whose research focuses on education policy, policy enactment in schools and other educational institutions, and the politics of education. A tiny bit of housekeeping tonight. I'm not going to do the fire exits, but they're up the back and you know where to go and what to do if an alarm sounds. I'm going to trust that. Tonight's event is being video recorded. It'll be available on the AARE website a little down the track. If you don't want your voice to be recorded, then please don't ask a question. But the video camera will not be turned on the audience at any point, so you're safe if you're camera shy. A particular welcome to our special guests, including the President of AARE, Professor Annette Woods, who is over there in the audience. And we welcome also Ms Aisha Langer, who's representing Mr Gerrard Dibb MP, the New South Wales Shadow Minister for Education, and note his apology, along with those of the Honourable Dan Tehan, Commonwealth Minister for Education, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, Commonwealth Shadow Minister for Education, and Ms Tamara Smith MP, who is the New South Wales Greens spokesperson for Education, all of whom would have liked to have joined us tonight but were unable to. And of course, a special warm welcome to our panellists and our moderator for this evening. From left to right, we have Mr Robert Randall, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority since November 2012. Next up we have Professor Adrian Piccoli, who's the Director of the Gonski Institute for Education at the University of New South Wales and former New South Wales Minister for Education from 2011 to 2017. Next we have Dr Jessica Gerrard, who's a Senior Lecturer in Education at the Melbourne Graduate School, Senior Lecturer in Education, Equity and Politics at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne, and one of Australia's leading emerging scholars in the field of education policy. And last but definitely not least, Professor Rob Lingard, Emeritus Professor of the University of Queensland and Professorial Research Fellow at the Australian Catholic University. Bob is internationally renowned for his research in education policy and the sociology of education. Finally, in the role of Tony Jones for this evening, our moderator, Dr Glenn Savage, is over here. Glenn is a Senior Lecturer in Education Policy at the University of Western Australia and an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow 2016 to 2019. Glenn's another of our leading emerging scholars in the field of education policy and sociology, and the idea for this evening's event originated with him, and indeed he ran a similar forum in Melbourne some months ago now. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Glenn, who will talk us through the structure of the evening and get us started. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, thank you all for coming and choosing the forum over the pub in the Melbourne Cup. It's a real privilege to be here tonight for what I think is a really important event about the politics of education policy in Australia at the moment. Central to our event tonight, and you would have seen this from the title, is an interest in unpacking the three dimensions of evidence, expertise and influence, and how these three areas interact in the making of policy and the doing of policy. So we see these areas as particularly crucial to reflect on at this historical juncture, as each is increasingly contested and subject to complex and often bitter debate. More than ever, policymakers, researchers and practitioners are being asked to defend the evidence that they use, to justify why the voices of some experts might be given preference over others. And there's also increasing awareness and criticism of the networks of influence that determine what counts as evidence and expertise in the first place. So in many ways, I think that Australian schooling reform is the gift that keeps giving for those with itchy feet. The past decade has seen unprecedented number of reforms, particularly at the national level, over a wide range of policy areas. And with each wave of reform, there's been new debates and new possibilities emerge for how evidence, expertise and influence are mobilised, contested and so forth. And there's also a large number of current policy developments that speak to these issues in particular. The Gonski 2 report that was released in March engages directly with the use of evidence in schooling and raises interesting questions about the forms of expertise and influence that are dominant in shaping contemporary conversations. Not only does the Gonski 2 report signal increasing federal government influence in shaping schooling policy in Australia's federal system, but it also strongly reflects what we might call a what works reform narrative, where policy decisions are framed as only justifiable where there's evidence of impact. Alongside this, we've had proposals for the creation of a National Research Evidence Institute and recommendations by the Productivity Commission for a national education evidence base. I see these as signalling a potentially new era for policymaking in Australia, in which decisions are guided by new national data infrastructures and hierarchies of evidence. These developments in schooling should not be accepted lightly, but instead I think it requires us to ask a number of questions, such as which kinds of evidence will count and which kinds of evidence can be counted? What exactly is impact, and why are some measures of impact seen as more important than others? Which experts and which forms of expertise are dominant in contributing to and influencing evidence production? What kinds of research knowledge will or will not be able to gain traction in emerging policy debates? And what is the role of the teaching profession in this emerging landscape? So, as Nicole said, we have an impressive cast of policy experts, political experts and academics who are each going to bring rich and distinct perspectives to the table. And we also, amongst the audience, have a rich wealth of experience and expertise, including many policymakers, academics, school leaders and teachers, all of you who are passionately engaged in education. So I'm going to get the debate going tonight by thinking about this concept of evidence and the changing role, the changing meaning of evidence, and how different forms of evidence shape the conditions of possibility for education. And Bob, I want to start with you, because so much of your recent work, Bob, has been around the rise of new forms of evidence, the creation of new data infrastructures in schooling, and the global rise of the what works and evidence-based reform movement. And to begin with, I want you to tell us, what do you see as either the possibilities or the limits that are emerging as we move into this direction of evidence-informed and what works policy?
Thanks, Glenn. It seems to me that the what works idea works with a sort of engineering conception of the relationship between evidence, research, policy making and professional practice in schools. And I think it also oversimplifies research and evidence, and I think research of all kinds, even in the natural sciences, but certainly in the social sciences, is always about probabilities and likelihoods, rather than this is exactly the case. So I would prefer a relationship between evidence and evidences of multiple kinds to policy and to practice, which was more an enlightenment relationship rather than an engineering one. And I think policy making and professional practice are really complex practices, and I think we can only ever have, and you used the phrase, evidence-informed policy and evidence-informed professional practice. I don't think we can have evidence-based. I mean, if we just look at the policy, that would lead us to a technocracy, and we're in a democratic society. Policy is the authoritative allocation of values. It's not simply determined by a particular construction of certain sets of evidence. And so I'd want to complexify both bits of it, which is not to say that evidence and research should not inform policy and professional practice. It clearly should, but I think it's only one component in the equation. And if we're looking at the school site, I think we perhaps are now not paying enough attention of the place, the significance of teacher professional judgment, and I'd like us to focus in on that as well, so that any evidence that comes is mediated by the teacher's professional judgment in that school, in that classroom, at that particular time. Yes, and while I think, just as one final point, I think there is an isomorphism between schools. They're all similar, but I think they're all simultaneously different. There's a thisness about each school, and I think that's true about the classroom. So I would want to see evidence as one element in policy production, but multiple kinds, and evidence and research as one element in professional practice. And I would want also a construction of the profession that was informing research as well as being informed by research. So I think the what works almost has a bit of a inert clinical construction of professional practice, and I think it isn't like that.
But it's also, you know, such an alluring ideal because no one wants to base policy around what doesn't work. No,
exactly. And at a superficial level, it seems like it's something we would all agree with, and that it gives and pays attention to the significance of research and other sets of evidence. And I think that's important. But I think the what works construction, the focus is on particular sort of research. And I think there's a bit of an arrogant certainty in an epistemological sense, which I think isn't there in any sort of research.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we look at a real life example of this, I mean, Adrian, during your time as Education Minister here in New South Wales, there was the creation of the Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation. Now, I think it's really interesting. It describes itself as Australia's first data hub for education, and it says that it will tell us what works to inform decisions in schools. And so I'm interested, Adrian, I mean, what's your take in terms of what led to the development of that centre? But also, I mean, what do you see the role for these kinds of organisations as playing, particularly in light of the Gonski II recommendation to create a national-style version of this?
I think if I just talk about the What Works movement, the problem with that is it lends itself, certainly at a political level, to there being a silver bullet to education improvement. And, you know, the thing you launched the silver bullet on is a press release, and I've always said the press release is the biggest threat to good education policy because it sounds good. It's in a lead up to an election, you say, you know, independent public schools work and we're going to fund them, or it might be a phonics check, or you know, this works. So I think it sort of lends itself to that kind of one-dimensional approach to education policy, whereas it's an art. You know, education is an art. You know, what makes a painting great? It's not the blue, it's not the yellow, and it's not the red, but it's actually the right combination of those things. So lots of things work in different, you know, in different contexts. So, you know, education at a political level can sometimes be, you know, people can try and boil it down to things that are too simple, and then errors get made for political reasons, not because people are trying to do the wrong thing, but to try and, you know, get a political message out there that we're doing things in education. On the issue of CESE, it was established really to have an in-house research capability within the department because outsourcing it was expensive and took too long. So in terms of the ability to analyse internal data from the department, Michelle Brunage has set it up when she was the Director General to have capability within the department to do this kind of data analysis and research. We could direct, or the department could direct it to do it, and it was quick. The department used its own data. Now it's kind of grown substantially since then. But in that sense, I think it performs, you know, a pretty effective role. In terms of the work that an organisation like CESE does, I looked at the annual report of the department a couple of weeks ago. $15 million they spend in consultancies and research. Very little of it was spent at universities. A lot of it was spent with consulting firms. Consulting firms, you pay them and you will get roughly what you want. And if you want to change a couple of sentences because politically they're dynamite, they'll change them. Universities, however, have huge credibility and trust, but they just take too long. And, you know, when you want research done, they do some research, but the general view is that universities take too long. You've got to get ethics approval and blah, 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 and they just take too long. And I think there's a weakness there. And part of my interest in being involved in a university is to try and bridge that gap. People trust universities. If you do something, if a department does some work around staffing and they get KPMG or Boston Consulting Group to do it, no one, they could say whatever they like, no one will trust it, because it's all about cost cutting. Unions, first thing they'll say. In a university, Sydney, any other university does it. It's huge trust, but can they wait 5 years to get,
So if we try and draw a line between what Bob was saying about kind of multiple forms of evidence, and then we have this organisation, and then, Jess, I'm looking at you because you're a kind of qualitative researcher. You do a lot of work that's sociological, that's historical. But then if you look on the website of, the centre, it says it works with an evidence hierarchy, right? And there's a gold standard that's at the top. And, at the top is randomised control trials and meta-analyses. So, I mean, given that the work that people do within universities is often not that in education faculties, I mean, what does this say about the way that other researchers are positioned, in relation to what counts as good evidence?
Look, it's a funny situation to be in when your bread and butter work is producing knowledge and evidence, but you find yourself arguing against the framing and the enthusiastic uptake of something like evidence-based policy. And Bob's touched on some of those issues, and I think particularly concerning is this hierarchical organisation of evidence where random controlled trials, statistical knowledge, other things like meta-analyses are thought to be more certain, more robust, more concrete than other forms of research knowledge, such as, for instance, qualitative in-depth interviews with school teachers about their experience, or an ethnography of homeless people and their engagement in education and work, which heads up was the most recent research project that I've done. So my concern here is that, I'll break it down to three things. Firstly, that the kind of knowledge that is produced through a kind of statistical or very particular causal research project is interested in, it in effect becomes very narrow because it has to bracket out so many other contextual factors in order to produce a certainty about social phenomenon. And social phenomenon, as Bob was saying, we don't work in certainties. We can't rely on a medical model of research, which random control trials come from, for something like classroom practice. And you can see this, for instance, in John Hattie's very influential book, Visible Learning. You just have to look at the preface where he says, and I'm sure he wouldn't have any problems with me pointing this out because he wrote it, that he bracketed out of his study so any factor that was out of school, and he positioned out of school factors as being socioeconomic status, gender, family background, neighbourhood kind of context. So he bracketed out all of those things and then did this massive meta-analysis about what works in classrooms. And when you think about that, it becomes unsurprising that the biggest finding was that teachers have the most impact, because you've bracketed out all of these other things that clearly have an impact. So we end up with these kind of findings that don't actually get us far enough, and we don't have enough understanding of the social phenomenon to make sense of it. Historical examples are around, the presumption that women were incapable of public life because they were not in public life, and so therefore they can't do public life. Well, we need sociological understandings of those phenomena to make sense of the numbers, to make sense of those sorts of data. My second issue is perhaps more methodological, and that's around the kind of questions that get asked and the ways in which they get answered. And I've kind of talked a little bit about that with meta-analyses, but also with random control trials and so on. They can only do so much. And when other research knowledge gets sidelined, we lose so much knowledge about what's happening in classrooms and in education. And in particular, we lose sight of perhaps the people who are most, that we should be concerned about most in education. We have an issue with inequity, and we lose sight of the research that really profiles the voices and experiences of people who are currently disadvantaged and marginalised. And my third one, and I'll be quick on this, is the relationship between politics and policy. And I think it's really interesting that, politically speaking, evidence-based policy becomes very popular around some reforms, but yet not around other reforms. So school autonomy, great example. There's no evidence to say that it has a positive impact on student achievement, but yet it gets rolled out. There's no random controlled trial on that. There's no random controlled trial on the funding of elite private schools, but yet we do these things. So we need to be very careful. And actually, a colleague here at Sydney University, Associate Professor Sue Goodwin, reminded me of a really helpful term to think about that, which is policy-led evidence. And I think we can get into a trap of that when political interests try and wrestle evidence for their own purposes. It's not like there's a glut of, there's not like there's a dearth of good quality educational research that's already there. Might take 5 years to produce, but the findings are there, they're written up. We can access that knowledge in order to inform our policy.
So I want to come back to the policy nexus in a minute. Just for the moment though, Rob, I'm going to bring you into the conversation here.
I was enjoying that, I was happy.
You're in the business as CEO of a car of essentially helping put evidence to work on a daily basis, or, being part of conversations that curate evidence. And I'm interested in how, with a car, as an example, what do those processes actually look like? For us who don't know what it's like on the other side in the policy world, how do you, at the policy coalface, decide who to talk to, who not to talk to, which experts you work with, what types of evidence come into the frame, what gets put out of the frame?
I will probably take the curriculum example as one, because again, and it tries to draw upon some of these things. When we went back in 2008-9, started with the curriculum, the proposition was to say, what do we know, and how do we get more people involved than not? So again, and I'll do a shorthand view, people can go back to our curriculum development process just to say, here's what we're seeking to do. So it was a matter of trying to, in terms of forming up, the initial papers, to draw the evidence together about what we knew, what worked. And I actually think that term actually is a useful term. Yeah. If I go back to when I first started teaching, whenever I work with, it's a good question. What works? Can you give me some leads? It's not a matter of saying this is it entirely, but we've got to be careful of, how the language enables us, and not sort of continue to diss it. But back to the curriculum. So we set, there's a process there, curriculum development process, the stage process, going out, involving expert. There were people from this university leading, researchers based, became the leaders of some of the initial papers. They led the writing process. So it was, from the start, founded as much as we could in research, people leading research into that space. That didn't stop the contest, because already along the way, this is all contested. Someone who's a leading person in English, Peter Freebody, led the English writing stuff. Well, there's a whole bunch of other people who thought Peter was wrong on a whole range of things. Yeah. But it was a matter of starting that process, and again, engaging the profession. We went out and consulted with as many people as we could. Again, I can remember being told at one stage we were consulting with too many people, just get on with it. So there's this nice thing. So I'm more than happy. So if I took that as an example, we could use other ones, but of a process to say, firstly, there it is. Here's the basis on which we're going to make the judgments. Even to the point when we got the consultation feedback about trying to say, when we get this feedback, we will publicly put it back out to people. We will respond to, we had to aggregate in some ways. Here's what this group said, or this is what this group of people said, and here's what we've done or not done with it, to try to do it in a very open way. Now, so we've sought to do that. What I want, and if this is now getting ahead of your question, what I think is the foundation that's there now, and again with the signing of the new national agreement, the proposition about taking the national curriculum to another level, my own view is that we now that we've got national agreement, broad national agreement on that, what research, what extra learning, what have teachers found, what have researchers found, how can we now build upon it? So rather than start afresh, part of my answer to your question would be, the challenge will be now not in what we did, but how we build upon and continue, to continue to build upon that foundation going forward. We could quickly, some may want me to go to my school. There was an interesting political decision. The basic proposition being, here's data that the broader public and others should have available to them. Transparency, accountability, choice are all the words that are there. Now, again, you can have evidence which says put more information in the hands of people. It'll help them understand what's going on. It'll help them engage in a participative democracy. It'll help them make informed decisions. There's evidence to support that. There's evidence against it.
Yeah.
What I do think there is what's interesting now with something like my school. There's a range of information out there. People have access to more information than they had before. Not everyone likes it. There's a whole bunch of people who like it. So how do we build the evidence base? How do we keep this going from a point of policy?
But on this point about, you know, what works, I mean, some people will say this works, other people will say that works. And then you invariably get this contestation around what works. And I mean, Adrian, I'm looking at you because it would be very interesting from my perspective to know, as an education minister, when you've got people coming to you with polarised or conflicting claims about what works and what is their evidence or the evidence that you should be following, how do you go about that? How did you go about that? You know, sort of mediating those counterclaims and trying to do what you thought was the right thing.
Well, I mean, I think the good practice there is to always triangulate the advice that you get. So, you know, we might get advice from the department that on an issue, here are the three options. Well, we would triangulate. I would personally check it if it was around. Well, of course, if it was anything to do with schools, I'd meet with the principal associations, but I'd also meet directly with principals to make sure that actually what I was being told actually matched what was happening on the ground.
Right.
So I think that's the best way to check the evidence. Now, again, it's not the minister's role to actually, in a sense, to do that. Like, you know, I'm not an educator. I'm essentially the civilian arm of this process, you know, and I always took that approach. We didn't embed policy in our office, as I think too many ministers do. You know, we took advice, but then we checked it, we double checked it, and you know, it did occur on many times where on the ground they were saying different things. So I think that's the best way to check that the advice that you're getting is right. So
this actually is a really nice transition into thinking about experts and sort of whose voices might get heard or not heard, and so on. And I mean, a common claim that we hear is that, you know, some groups or some individuals get more of a say than others over steering the debate, or even when everyone gets a seat at the table, not all voices might be equally heard. And I mean, I understand that we can't avoid this. This will always be the case. But I mean, one of the particular criticisms lately has been that certain think tanks or lobby groups or education businesses and so on are now starting to exert disproportionate influence over policy decisions. I mean, would any of you like to comment on that claim?
Yeah. I think think tank research is very different in kind from the sort of research that's done by academics in universities, because I think what think tank research is about, the think tank usually has a political, ideological position. It usually takes the policy problem as given rather than thinks about the particular construction of the policy. I think it does research and writes reports which has explicit audiences in mind. One, the media, and two, the politicians. And I can remember once when I did a report for a government and the minister told me my problem was that I was two-handed. I'd say on the one hand this might be the case and on the other hand, and that what he wanted was a one-handed set of research advice. And I think in some ways that the think tanks, that's what they do. Could I comment on Adrian's point? I mean, I think all policy is an admixture of politics, you know, as it ought to be, because you're elected. You know, the civil service isn't, the researchers aren't, but evidence, yes, and I would hope of multiple kinds, but I also think professional knowledge is. And I was thinking when I was listening to the discussion, if you take climate change, you know, I mean, a Prime Minister has gone and he lost the leadership last time around, at one level, energy policy and a recognition that climate change is occurring. And we have a government without an energy policy at the national level now. But all the evidence is overwhelming. But nothing's done. And I think that's the best example of politics overriding evidence and what the science says. A bad example, also, as well as being a good example, I would say.
Yeah, but you also have to, I think, appreciate that evidence is not the only force in nature.
No.
There is self-interest
Yes.
Don't worry, I'm a former Conservative politician, but I certainly agree with doing something about climate change and emissions.
Yeah.
But you know what the competing interest there is? I mean, people may believe the evidence, but their desire to manage their household bills overweighs. I know what the evidence says, but I don't want to pay more for my power bills. Yeah. And the same applies in education as well. Parents are a very strong political force and a political consideration in policy, which goes to, for example, your example about funding for non-government schools. Look, change that, and you're in for a huge political debate. Even though, it's pretty obvious that some schools don't need extra money, right?
So, Bob, you touched on the role of the media, and even when all voices are included in a debate, often what the public hears is only a highly selective version of the evidence driving a particular reform, and that's unavoidable to some extent. But in other cases, you get a kind of distortion of evidence through the media, which has resulted from groups or individuals strategically cherry-picking and seeking to push a particular political agenda through the media. I mean, do any of you want to comment on the role of the media, particularly as we've moved to more of a 24-hour news cycle, the way that policy ideas are filtered through the media, and that kind of nexus between politics, policy, media and expertise? Just a little question for you.
I'm happy to make a comment here, and that is that good education policy is really boring. Right? It's boring for the Daily Telegraph, it's boring for the Sydney Morning Herald, it's boring for the ABC, Channel 7, it's boring. You talk curriculum, you talk assessment, you talk pedagogy. I mean, when's the last time you saw the pedagogy word in a news article? Oh, maybe in the Sydney Morning Herald. But, it's boring. What's exciting is, here's the silver bullet, independent public schools, we're going to let them go and do whatever they like, phonics tests is the great thing, this is... From a media perspective, it's boring. It takes time to take effect. Hey, we're going to put this thing in place, and it's going to take 4 years to have any effect. That's not particularly exciting.
But that said, I mean, even with some of the big debates around school funding and areas that are not boring, according to the newspapers, I mean, it's actually really hard work to stay up to date with all the claims and counterclaims that are being made by various groups. And often, when you do kind of follow the chain of logic, you realise that people are being quite misleading. Often politicians who know full well that they're distorting the evidence. So I mean,
and the public and media and the political process doesn't have the patience for sound, evidence-based education reform to have an impact at a micro level or at a macro level. And I've given this example before. We understand with infrastructure, you build a North West Rail link, what have we spent there? We've probably spent $6 or $7 billion and not a single passenger's travelled. I mean, do we say it's a failure and we should stop doing it? No, of course not. But when it comes to education, and this was the debate about school funding, we've spent all this extra money on school funding, but results have gone backwards. So what, we should stop spending money in education? There's a lack of patience there around the time it takes actually for reform to have an impact at a macro level. It can have an impact at a school level immediately, but before you see it start to appear in HSE results or NAPLAN results, it takes a long time.
Well, Glenn, we can pursue your question about the media again, but I also think it's like evidence and assuming people take things too simplistic. If we come back to education, I do think we're at risk of underestimating the capability of the profession in terms of interpreting and engaging this. I think we're at risk of underestimating the broader community about these things. And sure, the distraction in media or others as they try to simplify it, but and I think the bigger challenge is actually, that's the more substantive future-based challenge. How do we keep the broader community capable to engage in these important debates and discussions and not get distracted by those who've got shorter attention spans or cycles or something. So again, I think we're at risk in some of these things of saying not this, not that, and false dichotomies and all those others. I think if we focus on the profession, we've got to come back to, and that's why I come back before, I think it's absolutely legitimate to say, here are 5 things that work in teaching maths or whatever. Now again, professionally, you could choose those or you can choose some others, but not sort of say you've got to go and find it yourself. But then the test comes is 5 things that work for what purpose?
in this context.
Or in this content or something like that. Because in all the things you've said, what's the purpose that we want to apply evidence or expertise or influence to? I mean, we could come back and broadly, let's agree here now, what is it that how would we measure the success of funding? Now, so HSC results, my own view is that's one indicator, but it's not broad enough. And other things like that. So I guess, but I come back to your question of the media. I think let's not let ourselves play into that. Let's stick with, in this case, the profession or the broader community, and the two are linked. Our broader community, the broader proposition is we've got to keep our community capable and engaged, literate, numerate, and all those other things so that they can focus on the long-term game and not let, if that happened, politicians run us certain ways or the media run us in certain ways.
Can I ask Rob a question of a story?
No, he asked the question.
Of last week, right? So last week the Daily Telegraph ran what I thought was a disgusting story about your 95 Indigenous, I can't remember how they described it, but materials around teaching science and whatever. And they're a disgusting story around, I mean, quite a racist...
The cartoon was worse.
Quite a racist story about it. Now, what can happen there is, Minister sees the front page and gets up, does a press conference and says, we will not be implementing that at Akara because that's the knee-jerk response. Now, I don't know what happened at a political level. I don't have to buy the news. It was my mother's news, but I don't buy the Daily Telegraph. I don't have to. but what was the feedback from that?
Well, so the feedback is, again, if you actually go and watch the discussion amongst the teachers out there, they understand the value of it, both in terms of engagement. They understand it overall, not all of them, there's some, but I think our measures, we would sort of say the feedback we got monitoring other channels, so a multi-channel sort of cast here, that they actually understood the intention, they saw the opportunity to better engage, they see the commitment and want to follow through on it. I think, again, some of those, it is that whole thing of fish and chip wrappers. I think also, though, again, we had run the justification to broader sources. So we had, and again, in that case, it was interesting, the Prime Minister backed it. The Minister for Aboriginal Affairs backed it. And other things like that. So that was on the basis of, and by the way then, that wasn't just a thought bubble that came up. The work there has been long running. It's based upon going out and engaging with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in each state and territory, the science educators, the science academics, so that we've built them up to it. So fish and chip,
terrific.
Yeah, fish and chip wrappers, I think, in that one. But the worry a little bit is there is still that, and there's a community challenge for us, there's still a view out there that people don't get why you'd want to increase people's understanding of the history and culture of the first people here as part of a broad, rich education system, and that you can legitimately do it as you teach science. Not a different science, the same science that was there 3 months ago before we put these, but that you can do it, and it's likely to have more engaged young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, as well as non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. But yep, fish and chip wrappers, I hope.
So let's talk about the profession, because
do we get fish and chip? They don't wrap it in newspaper anymore, do they?
No.
Health standards.
It seems to me that there's something kind of weird about the way that the profession is constructed sometimes in debates about schooling, because if you look at other professions, so say the medical profession, which is often used as an example, I mean, doctors and surgeons and so on, they're seen to possess the expertise and they are the experts of their profession, and there's a sense of ownership. Now, I'm not saying that's not the case in education completely, but if education mirrored the medical profession, then surely the experts would primarily be the teachers and expertise would primarily lie in their hands. But my sense is the way that education is often discussed, it's the economists or the statisticians or the kind of global policy entrepreneur who's positioned as the expert speaking to the profession. It's a provocation. I mean, do any of you want to take that up?
Well, I think, the teaching profession has been in a peculiar position historically and in the present day. I think partly to do with the history of the feminisation of the teaching profession and the act of professionalisation that happened throughout the 20th century. And what we see now is because education and schooling, and particularly mass education, is such a politically invested enterprise with huge money attached to it, it's never really been wrestled from the hands of government in terms of a professional body. So, a body like AITSL, for instance, which is meant, in its remit, is meant to stand in as a kind of professional body, if you like, isn't really representative of the profession. You know, it doesn't have those kind of links to the teachers themselves as the medical equivalent does. So we're in a curious state of affairs. I think you're right, Glenn, where you know, who counts as having expertise in education are often those who are not within the kind of the street level kind of people within the profession. And you see the same thing in terms of research knowledge, the kind of the type of research knowledge that often gets privileged in political discussion is those that come from a kind of a longer what's the word? Step away from classrooms than the research that's actually concerned with the everyday matter of teachers. And the consequence of that is that we don't have enough of an opportunity to hear from teachers themselves, to have unions and teachers as a part of the public discussion. And when they are a part of the discussion, they're often positioned as being argumentative or troublesome, as opposed to contributing to a robust public debate about education.
But there's a really interesting tension, because I have a friend who's a principal. He's my kind of check on things sometimes, you know, and you know, AITSL did do a lot of consultation with teachers and school leaders as part of the creation of the national standards. But then, you know, I talked to him about these things, and he's like, well, we go to their, you know, we meet with them, or we do professional development, and they tell us what we have to do. There's no... So even though, you know, AITSL might say, well, we've done a lot of consultation, the felt reality on the ground, I feel, is either different from what AITSL would perceive it to be, or there's a disconnect between a federal organisation and say a rural school in Western Australia.
Well, the interesting word there is consultation. So consultation versus control, like who controls the organisation, and then how they have a say within that organisation, versus being consulted about something and then being kind of given the result of that consultation.
I mean, if you look at the structure of AITSL and the membership structure and compare it with, say, teacher registration boards at the state level, all of which have mandated requirements of teachers from classrooms of this kind, from these kinds of schools being on the board, so they're more, whereas AITSL doesn't have anyone who's a classroom teacher there. I think it has system people, and I think it's indicative of the point that you were alluding to, that teaching's tended to be much more a state-mandated profession. And I think there's a lot of things which flow from that in comparison with the medical profession, I think. And it's deemed almost to be too important to let the teachers, I mean, wrongly in my view, but I think that's the way it's constructed. And I think, you know, as we moved into the sort of economies we have, the emphasis on schooling as human capital development and so on, it is those away from schooling, the economists and others who I think have formulated the big macro policy rather than the knowledge of the profession. The thing that interests me in Gonski 2.0, in the talk about the Research and Evidence Institute, the thing that I found appealing in that, there's a lot of talk in it about the need for bottom-up research from the schools and classrooms and the teachers that way, because it's all being done to rather than by and with, I think, the profession.
Again, the challenge is we should go and book and get more time here tonight and go through to... If we're going to take this seriously, we shouldn't just draw on some. So if we just took for a moment, though, the analogue with the medical profession and sort of say we should be more like. Again, the medical profession is not independent of government standards and government control and influence. Take them away and the community would be upset about all these doctors not meeting standards and trying their own thing. I mean, the short quip which says you won't have a doctor sort of saying, you know, I'm going to try this today because it might be more interesting for me, you know. And again, that's a cheap shot both at doctors and also the teaching profession. But again, you've got to, it's not as if they are a total independent, you know, they operate within standards that the community expects that are appropriate there. So the question then would be, how would you build those? We just had a little shot at independent public schools a moment ago. Now, as a political idea, that's the idea of saying this school is independent. We're going to give them much more freedom to make decisions about how they run and give them that. Now, is that valuing the profession or not. So I think it's an interesting one for the profession, for a debate like this, to say, let's actually, rather than, and again, this is meant to be a quick session, rather than putting the question out and responding, what would it actually look like to say, let's actually get, because it's not going to happen in the next 3-year or 6-year cycle, which teacher professional body out there has got a 10-year plan to get it and is prepared to put it out there and not just say it's all about us. It's actually about a balance. It is that balance. This community trusts a lot and expects a lot from teachers. So how do you balance that through? Example we would have used previously, in the medical profession, is the reading one. Now again, we could have a debate here, but there's broad agreement about the place of phonics in kids' reading. Not that it's the only one, it's in a balanced program, but there is a place for it. It's in the curriculum. Does that mean right now, and so you can back the research, you can do all those others. If I go out there and if I went out there and tested it right now, and so the equivalent of the medical profession, it's tested, it's set there as part of the standards, doctors will follow it. Can we expect the same thing from teachers teaching reading in kindergarten year 1 and 2? And do we all think that's what's happening out there? Now I think it's changing, but it's an interesting example. So my response on that would be, let's get a professional body pitching 10 years out and getting it, but the risk, both in politics as well as organisations, is we're good at flipping and flopping. We're not always good at running the long course or the medium course on some of these things.
So with the flipping and flopping, I mean, my research, as you know, is on federalism and schooling. I mean, a lot of the flipping and flopping seems to be politically driven, federal agenda versus state agenda, the difficulty of actually trying to get those to line up sometimes. And I mean, building on the conversation around AITSL and others, I mean, one of the things that I've found in my work is that people are quite resistant to some things purely on the basis that they're coming from a federal body or, so I mean, these dynamics are really interesting. I mean, would any of you like to comment on that? Because Gonski, to me, Gonski too, signals a very strong interest in the federal government in expanding the conditions placed on what happens in schools, even though the federal government doesn't control schools.
My response to that is, the economic well-being of this country is in part due to the strong education system we've had. You can then have an argument to say that can be sustained in by states and territories. My proposition to that is, it's clear in 2 or 3 or so of the states you can maintain that effort, but you can't maintain the same effort. So again, the argument is there is a national interest argument in maintaining high standards in education, setting expectations for kids wherever they go in the country, increasing the mobile population, all those others. So if you get heads nodding, there's one nodding there a bit, then the question is, how far do you go? Now, what you could go is to say, and I'm not arguing this, but for an argument's sake, you could go to sort of say, now at the other end of the research, it's the school that makes the difference. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
So between those two things, setting national expectations and these, let's again have a thought experiment about what would be the best arrangement. And the challenge that comes is that added value of states and territories and the like. And there's where I'd sort of, and I think that's what, I'm not making the argument, as a body which is owned by 9 or run by 9 education ministers, I'm right in amongst it a lot of the time, but it is that notion of what are we trying to achieve? It's my point earlier on about purpose, and when we come up with some of these things, what's our proposition, our hypothesis or whatever, and what are we prepared to follow through on it? But schools, we know, make a difference, and that's where all the hard work's going to get done. How can we better support them? And I'd argue at the other end, it is a national interest argument to set the standards and do it. Now let's fill in the gaps about then in between that, what we would then do. What do we know? And we've got 8 examples. As this federation, we've got a lot of evidence. You could bring some evidence to say this appears to be working better here than here. It's, we've got as much variation in our federation sometimes as you do amongst 8 different countries. So I would say, given a sweet spot, where would it land in that arrangement? That's if you accept it's a national interest thing and schools are the fundamental unit of change and improvement. If you accept those two, fill in the middle or not.
So I want to change tack slightly. Like, we've been talking mainly about individuals, groups, politics, the media. I'm interested in how certain policies or certain forms of data might serve as political actors in their own right. So, I mean, you only need to mention NAPLAN in front of a group of teachers to get often polarised and very passionate views about what they think about NAPLAN. And so, I mean, at this point in time, as we get this sort of rise of new forms of data infrastructure, new metrics and measurements within the country and also beyond that affect us, is it a stretch to say that these policy technologies and forms of data now serve as political actors in their own right?
Well, if we take the NAPLAN example, which of course is everyone's favourite topic of conversation, what we're seeing now is the production. I mean, and this speaks to what I was earlier talking about in terms of the privileging of particular types of evidence and the sorts of effects that then has on our understanding of the phenomenon itself. So NAPLAN's a point-in-time test of student achievement. That's pretty much all it tells us. And yet it's, through the political act of producing the My School website, it's now a proxy piece of evidence upon which the community, parents, are making judgments around the quality of schooling and decisions around that. And it doesn't tell us about that, it tells us about a particular form of student achievement. So we're having this kind of particular forms of data that are getting produced, most predominantly statistical data, nice neat numbers that seem certain and stable, and then their use is getting stretched so far that they end up being deployed within debates in education well beyond what they can actually capably tell us about the phenomenon itself. And so there is a kind of almost an independent agency of the numbers themselves. Once they get out there, there's a whole range of unintended effects that then flow on, and perhaps at times intentional effects when you're thinking about how they're used politically.
Do you think it's almost as if the data itself is seen as a source of truth that sort of stands beyond the politics of its own creation?
Oh, it's absolutely seen in that way, and I think that's the problem with the hierarchy of knowledge, of evidence base, is that there's a presumption that these so-called higher or more stable forms of knowledge can stand above kind of the messiness of everyday life in schools, or the complexity of social and cultural phenomena and the kinds of complex interactions that schools... I mean, you think about spaces of schools, they're a convergence of such an array of different people. You have got teachers, their own background and their working conditions. You've got parents, a range of diverse backgrounds. You've got the students themselves, school leaders. You've got the policies themselves impacting. This is a hugely complex organ, if you like. And there's no way that a number can distill kind of the significance of that. But yet, because they seem so tantalisingly certain, they then have a life of themselves. And I think that it's used, politically, that is then kind of strategically deployed at times for political interests.
NAPLAN is the King Kong of education kind of policy, because it's it started off relatively harmless on this little island, and now it's it's ripping down buildings and swatting away aeroplanes. I mean, it's just become this dominant thing in public discourse around education. Every policy is around, will it change NAPLAN results? I mean, we pinch the idea. This is why I like competitive federalism. Western Australia had the 3 Band 8 things in NAPLAN as a literacy and numeracy prerequisite for Year 12. We applied it here because people said, the whole argument every time NAPLAN results came out, isn't it well terrible, flatlining or whatever. Okay, I'm a politician. Let's get improved NAPLAN results. Look what they did in Western Australia. We did it here, and everyone went, oh my God, it's terrible. Right? Yeah, 25% improvement in Year 9 NAPLAN results in 1 year. What happened the next year? When I got replaced. The next minister, who's a very good friend of mine, don't worry about that, he got rid of it because of the public kind of outcry. And I told journalists who didn't like the 3 Band 8 thing, well, stop writing every time NAPLAN results come out. Stop writing that you want the results to go up. Because there we go, we did something, got a 25% improvement in 1 year, and you hate it and you wanted to get rid of it.
So Rob, we have to get your view on this.
Look, I mean, again, I'm responsible for running the program. Left to my own devices, talking with a whole range of people, I reckon we could move on from the state we're in and get to a better state. But again, let's not get naive about people using it. People use the data in a whole range of ways, so it's not as if it's goods all on one side and bads on the other. I agree with you. There's a whole paper now. Everyone's guilty of it, but here, spot the difference. If we invest more in early childhood education, we'll improve kids' NAPLAN results. Or if we invest more in kids' early childhood education, we'll improve their literacy and numeracy. Which one's the intention of the policy? The first one was the announcement, when a while ago. So here's again, so Adrian's point. We think it's really important that kids have band 8s as part of their high school certificate. Or we think it's important for kids to have a literacy and numeracy standard as part of their high school certificate. And actually to have the HSC stand for something, not just a participation certificate. So the really interesting question is, we're all guilty of it in terms of the conflation we do. And again, you know, I mean, Adrian and I have talked about it, come up, you know, change the thing, but I think we can evolve it. But again, I don't think anyone's saying that, that's why I come back to purpose. Surely, helping kids develop literacy and numeracy is a necessary, not sufficient, purpose of schooling. With all the complication, mums and dads and all those others and doing it, but surely that's one of the things. Now, if we want to, we could take the data away, or we could actually say, let's actually put a more complete discussion about it. Now, those who don't like, you know, and it's a complex, messy piece, but I know, I mean, again, we can go, I mean, we're pretty confident at our place to say, and again, give parents the respect they deserve. I do not accept that there's a whole bunch of parents out there choosing schools on the basis of their NAPLAN results. I do agree, because I've done it myself. My children transfer school and they ask for the NAPLAN results. When I was a secondary maths teacher, I asked all the primary school kids coming to our school for some maths information. Not because I was going to, you know, it was actually because to try to get some information so we could start where they're teaching. So, again, this could be the King Kong and we're just all going to continue to quake in it, or we could take it on in a more responsible fashion. But we actually, in our own language, are sometimes guilty of perpetuating the myths or the false intentions about NAPLAN.
So given yep, Bob?
Yeah, it seems to me, in terms of evidence-informed policy, one of the things we don't do particularly well in Australia is, and it's in all the rational approaches to policy making, is introduce a policy and have an inbuilt evaluation process. And I think that we should have had an inbuilt evaluation process in and around NAPLAN, and 10 years maybe would have been a good time to do it. But could I just make
we can evaluate why having NAPLAN around hasn't improved literacy and numeracy results.
Yes, exactly.
It's not, doesn't make sense as a proposition, because how would you know if you're improving or not without some collection of data? NAPLAN wasn't designed to improve literacy and numeracy, it was to provide to have some information. So you could have policy discussion about what works. Adrian's given examples where he can point to them. I don't think it improved teaching in New South Wales. I think it improved kids' engagement. It improved their engagement because all of a sudden it counted. There you go. There's
I can tell you. I had the high school principal say, when we introduced him, he was very upset about it. He said, now, do I need to look at Year 7 results and see who's not going to meet in Year 1 and start focusing on them? I sat there saying, are you really saying this to me? And he realised what he was saying was a bit... But it was starting to change, actually, the practices.
Literacy and numeracy matters.
Literacy and numeracy, yeah. It wasn't done to get better NAPLAN results, as you say. It's so you get better literacy. As a parent, as a parent, I've had one kid do the Year 3 NAPLAN. I actually found that information really useful. That my kids go to a country school, you know, I wanted to make sure they're doing as well as any kid in a city school, and it's a good way of getting that kind of moderation as a parent. I mean, I couldn't care less what my school's results are on the My School website. I think that's the King Kong, isn't it? My School, actually.
I was going to say, who tamed King Kong? Who tamed King Kong in the movie?
It's
been a long time.
In a historical sense, I mean, you know, I'm going to go to the audience in just a second, but I'm thinking the way NAPLAN really, in a historical sense, is the beginning in terms of, you know, what's emerging around data and evidence. I mean, you look at the radical shifts that are emerging as a result of AI, you know, big data analytics, increased computational capacities and so forth. I mean, surely, you know, this is just the beginning of a new world of how we gather data, understand data, and to me that raises really interesting questions around who is in control of the data, who uses the data, how the data is interpreted, and so on. So just before we go to the audience, I mean, how do we ensure in this world that we're moving into that, you know, if we come back to Rob's idea that it should be about the kids in the schools making improvements, how do we ensure, as Elon Musk has put it, I didn't think I'd ever quote Elon Musk in a presentation before, but that these new emerging technologies work for us rather than against us, to put it in very simple terms?
Well, again, two parts to this answer. When there was been some great discussion around AI, and someone, again, if you use the medical profession, a while ago, people were citing the scanning capability and its increased ability to identify skin lesions and stuff. Greater certainty and a bit more quickly than human doctors could. And someone took up that argument in a discussion with a medical profession and said, don't you think this is going to deprofessionalise you? And the person says, no, I'm going to use this data. I'm still the one that's going to make the judgment about what we do using the data. And I'd take that example and bring it over here. Now, then my next point would be, we do need to mind where the data is. And so there's a lot of discussion around about the Formative Assessment Initiative post-Gonski. And certainly ACARA's view, not alone, but ACARA's view has been to say, don't mix, and some ministers want to conflate formative assessment with that'll get rid of NAPLAN. They're different purposes. If you want to give better data in the hands of teachers, it should stay in the school. Otherwise, you're going to distort the purpose. So if you're going to follow that, and again, that desire to give more information, and we've got to have a discussion about which information and availability and all those others, but again, it's purpose. If it's to help the teacher make a good professional judgment about what to do next, leave it with the teacher. Leave it as that purpose. Don't allow it to come out. So there needs to be some good policy about purpose of data and therefore where it's left or where it doesn't, the Chinese wall or whatever the new terminology, because we probably shouldn't, in terms of come up with a different wall there and put it in there.
But Bob, to your work, you've been looking at data infrastructures, the creation of them, but you've also got a project looking at commercialisation of schooling. And they're obviously connected. Yeah. So, how do you see those two pieces playing out?
Yeah. So I'd say a couple of things. Certainly the work we've looked at and done in the USA, that the data info... So when President Obama introduced Race to the Top as a modification on No Child Left Behind, the federal money was only made available to local schooling authorities, states, if they created data infrastructures which were aimed at improving learning outcomes and so on. There was a lot of Bill Gates money put into 11 states, and there were private companies that were going to create these data infrastructures. And once the community and parents got wind of this, and in particular Pearson was heavily involved in this, the Gates Foundation put in 80 million, then when public concerns arose, another 20 million. But the upshot of it all was issues around data privacy, data about young people, linked to an individual identifier, being in private hands with the possibility of on-selling it to third parties. So there were a huge number of issues raised, and it seems from the interviews that we've done there about this, that the parents are happy if data infrastructures are public data infrastructures, if there's tight privacy legislation. One of the issues in the US is that there was a desire to link all of the data across health, welfare, the criminal justice system and so on, and data following young people across the life cycle. So there were a huge range of concerns, but the biggest, I think, was around, in a public schooling system in those 11 states, the concern, and in actual fact, the whole project, this In Bloom project, collapsed, basically because of parental and community concern, that this was a sort of private involvement at the deepest level of structuring the systems. And there was real concern about that, and concern that I sort of shared.
Look, I always like to finish these sorts of things with a kind of big sky question, which are difficult to answer. I understand that. But this is the question to all of you. If you had the power and the money, potentially, to change just one thing about the way that the politics of evidence, expertise and influence play out in Australian schooling, what would it be? It could be one very specific thing or it could be something more fundamental, but what would you do to change the state of affairs? Bob, do you want to go first?
I certainly would want a pressure for that data not being the only thing that drove what we did, either at a systemic policy level, school policy level, or in terms of teacher practice in classrooms. So I would want to give emphasis to valuing teacher professional judgment within the use of data and having that as a central element rather than the data driving.
Yes.
I don't like these one.
No, I'll give you 60 more seconds to answer the question. So, let's say I would make it a legal requirement that systems and governments have to put the interests of children ahead of the interest of adults in education policy. Yeah. That you would be breaching the law if you made a decision that put the interests of adults first, around issues of HR, IR, anything like that, where you actually breach the law. Because I think the greatest weakness in education, this goes to the question about staffing. Probably a large proportion of the best teachers in New South Wales go to teach 5 kilometres from where we're sitting here, not actually in the schools that need that expertise. They're teaching Rob Randall's kids, who don't need the best teachers in. I genuinely say this. They're not distributed to the schools where they actually are most required. I agree. And if you had an IR system that perpetuated that, then you'll be breaking the law. Here's your 60 seconds.
Oh, thanks. I think I'm going to go give a sociologist's answer, which is to say that I think what I would want to see is greater political commitment to acknowledging the actual power that is held in the current production of data and the strategic use of that. You mentioned before about what do we do? It's increasing this kind of datification, and we're kind of looking down the track. You can almost see the kind of influence of that data and numbers on practice in sometimes dystopian ways. But I actually think that denies the fact that we have politics in place that are producing it in the here and now, that are making it happen in the here and now through powerful and political interests. So I think I would like to see some interruption into that, and so thus a widening of data. But also, sorry, I'm going to just say that's not really one thing, is it? But anyway, I'm a sociologist, so it doesn't matter. That the discussion needs to also address the ethical and political dimensions of education and schooling beyond what data can tell us. And I think the recent debates around the inclusion and exclusions of LGBTIQ students and teachers in the non-government sector is a really good example of that, of the need to have really frank public debate about the broader purpose of schooling and making ethical decisions around that.
So I don't have. So what I would like to do is pursue the argument about increasing the respect and nature, the acknowledgement of the expectations of the profession. I think there's a whole bunch of teachers out there who do a fantastic job. I think more needs to be done because of the fundamental importance of education. So I'd be striving to enhance that, increase it. But again, it's not by doing away with these others, by actually grabbing all of this and building upon it and raising it. So you can get into, so that we can do the comparisons with other countries, where our teachers selected from, how much they get paid and all those others. They're little indicators that actually we've got more to go. I mean, someone who's got more history, research background than me, where the teachers came from before and where they're coming, but that's all a negative view. given their fundamental importance to the community, to the well-being of this country going forward, I'd be upping the ante, respect for, expectation of teachers.
All right, so I think we might end on that note. I just want to personally say thank you to all of the panel.